Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the rise of Timur, a conqueror who emerged from chaos to forge an empire built on both brilliance and brutality. But before we meet Timur, we need to step back, way back, because to understand how someone like him could rise, we have to first understand what fell. After the death of Genghis Khan, the once mighty Mongol Empire began to fracture like shattered glass. His descendants inherited pieces of the empire. Different khanates spread from the Middle East to China, but without a central hand to guide them, unity was gone. Instead of one powerful engine driving Eurasian affairs, you had rival clans pulling in different directions, fighting for scraps of legitimacy. And as that central Mongol authority crumbled, so too did the stability it once enforced. Now, what happens when a giant collapses? It doesn't just leave a hole, it sends shockwaves. Across Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East, a political vacuum opened up. No strong institutions, no overarching system, just warlords, rival claims, and vulnerable populations caught in the middle. And into that vacuum, ambition rushes in. This wasn't just political chaos, it was economic fragility, too. The famed Silk Road, that lifeline of trade connecting east to west, began to unravel. With fragmented control and regional insecurity, merchants feared bandits more than profits. Caravans slowed, trade cities declined, prosperity gave way to protection rackets and plunder. So if you're imagining a world of elegant Mongol diplomacy and booming markets, hit pause. The world Timur was born into wasn't a golden age, it was a shattered map, an open chessboard with no king, and plenty of pawns willing to become warlords. This is the backdrop. A broken empire, a world of shifting power, a perfect storm for someone ruthless, ambitious, and cunning enough to bend the chaos to his will. Now that the stage is set, let's meet the man who stepped into the void. So who was this man who rose from the ruins? Timur was born in 1336, near the city of Samarkand, right at the crossroads of broken empires and crumbling authority. But here's the twist. Timur wasn't royalty. He wasn't born into a ruling house. He came from a local Turkic Mongol tribe. So how did someone like him, without an official crown, build an empire that stretched across continents? One word: legitimacy. Timur understood the game of power better than most kings. He knew that in a world still haunted by the shadow of Genghis Khan, lineage mattered. So, he claimed descent from the great Khan himself, not directly, but through marriage and tribal affiliation. This wasn't just personal branding, it was a calculated move to place himself within the story of Mongol greatness. He positioned himself as the rightful heir, not to a throne, but to a legacy. But claiming bloodline wasn't enough. You had to act like a ruler, and Timur did just that, masterfully. He married into powerful families. He wrapped himself in Islamic legitimacy, aligning with religious scholars and institutions. And he wielded ruthless military force when persuasion failed. Through a mix of diplomacy, manipulation, and sheer brutality, Timur managed to unify a patchwork of city-states, tribal lands, and fractured provinces into a single expanding domain. What's fascinating is that Timur never declared himself a Khan. Not once. Instead, he styled himself as a restorer, as someone reviving the glory of Mongol rule rather than replacing it. That subtlety allowed him to claim continuity, not revolution. And it worked. People followed him, not just out of fear, but because he offered the illusion of stability in a world drowning in uncertainty. So here's the big idea. Timur wasn't just a warlord. He was an architect of perception. He built power on the ruins of others, yes, but also on myth, memory, and careful strategy. And once he had that power, the world would feel it. Now, let's talk about what Timur actually did with all that power, because once his empire started expanding, it didn't stop. His campaigns were vast, sweeping across Persia, India, Syria, Iraq, and Anatolia. These weren't brief border skirmishes or symbolic conquests. These were full-scale invasions. Timur's armies moved like wildfire, consuming cities, toppling rulers, and leaving devastation in their wake. If his rise was strategic, his rule was thunderous, but that thunder came at a horrific cost. Let's take Isfahan as one example, a jewel of Persian civilization. When the city resisted Timur, he retaliated with a massacre. Historical estimates suggest up to 100,000 people were slaughtered. The same fate befell Baghdad and Delhi. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a deliberate pattern. Mass killings weren't just about eliminating resistance. They were a message, a signature of terror. And it worked, because Timur wasn't just fighting battles, he was waging psychological warfare. He understood something chilling: if fear could move faster than an army. So he used terror as a tool. He ordered the construction of towers made entirely from human skulls, grim monuments placed outside city walls to say, this is what happens when you resist. And here's where the cost of centralized power really starts to show. Timur's empire was built not on shared governance or consent, but on domination. It was held together by fear, not structure. And fear, while powerful, is brittle. It doesn't inspire loyalty. It doesn't build systems. It simply paralyzes. What we see in Timur's campaigns isn't just conquest. It's a chilling example of how control through violence can stretch across continents without ever creating lasting unity beneath the surface. The empire grew, but the cracks were already forming. All right, by now, you've seen Timur's brutal side. But he wasn't just a conqueror drenched in blood. He also knew how to shape an image. In fact, some of his most enduring legacies weren't left on battlefields, they were carved into stone. Enter Samarkand. After rising to power, Timur transformed this city into the beating heart of his empire. Samarkand wasn't just a capital, it was a canvas. He rebuilt it almost from scratch, turning it into a glittering center of architecture, science, and statecraft. Streets were carefully laid out. Massive mosques and madrasas rose from the dust. Every corner of the city shouted, "This is civilization. This is greatness." It was urban planning with a political purpose. But why stop at buildings? Timur wanted glory. And for that, you need more than walls. You need stories. So he began attracting the best minds and hands across the empire. Artists, architects, scholars, craftsmen, they all flowed into Samarkand under Timur's patronage. He gave them resources, protection, and a clear mission: glorify the ruler, make the empire look eternal. In return, they created a cultural renaissance that dazzled the Islamic world and beyond. It was brilliant and calculated, because behind the elegance of domes and mosaics, Timur was building something deeper: symbolic power. These monuments weren't just artistic expressions, they were political tools. Massive buildings suggested divine favor. Grand ceremonies masked authoritarian control. The message was simple: only someone chosen by heaven could build something this beautiful, this sophisticated, this enduring. But here's the catch. While the walls were strong, the foundations were shallow. The empire looked like a masterpiece from the outside, but inside it was held together by force, not freedom. It's the classic move of rulers throughout history: build big, build beautiful, and hope no one notices the cracks in the system. So yes, Timur painted himself as a patron of culture, but he was also an illusionist, using art and architecture to cloak the violence behind the throne. And the illusion worked, for a while. Let's pull back the curtain for a moment, because while the monuments of Samarkand sparkled in the sunlight, much of Timur's empire was smoldering. Here's the uncomfortable truth: conquest is not the same thing as governance, and building cities doesn't fix broken economies. Beneath the decorative tiles and golden domes, Timur's campaigns had left entire regions economically gutted. First, agriculture, the lifeblood of any pre-modern empire. Timur's invasions devastated rural life. Farmlands were torched, irrigation systems were trampled or abandoned, whole communities were uprooted. When the people who grow the food are either dead or fleeing, you don't get stability, you get famine. Then there's trade. You might think a ruler sitting on the Silk Road would want to protect commerce, right? But Timur didn't nurture trade, he disrupted it. With every campaign, merchants were displaced, caravans rerouted, cities reduced to ashes. And remember, trade needs trust. It needs consistency. But Timur's empire offered chaos and coercion. You could build a shining capital like Samarkand, but if your surrounding lands are looted and lawless, the merchants stop coming. The illusion collapses. And speaking of illusion, here's where the illusion of order hits hardest. On paper, Timur ruled a vast empire. Maps from the time stretch his domain from India to Anatolia. But the reality was more fragile. His system wasn't built on economic productivity or administrative depth. It was built on plunder. Cities and regions weren't contributing through taxation or trade, they were being drained. Their wealth was stripped through force, then funneled back to the center. That's not an economy. That's organized extraction. Now, this might sound familiar. History has plenty of examples where centralized power replaces organic growth with brute control, where rulers mistake fear for loyalty, where short-term glory is mistaken for lasting strength. Timur created a spectacle of order, but behind the spectacle was scarcity, silence, and scorched earth. And yet, somehow his legacy didn't vanish with him. So, what did Timur actually leave behind? That depends on what kind of legacy you're looking for. Politically, his empire didn't last. After Timur's death in 1405, the structure he'd built began to unravel. There was no real administrative system to keep it going, no cohesive economic engine, and no deep loyalty binding the pieces together. Like a monument without a foundation, it started to crack as soon as the architect was gone. But culturally, that's where things get interesting. You see, Timur's descendants, the Timurids, turned out to be more than just warlords. They became patrons of science, art, literature, and learning, and in many ways, they kicked off a cultural golden age in the Islamic world. Cities like Herat and Samarkand became hubs of intellectual life. Thinkers and artists thrived. Manuscripts were copied, studied, debated. Astrolabes were calibrated. Poems were written that still echo through Persian literature today. It's one of history's great ironies. The man who destroyed cities left behind a dynasty that built libraries. The conqueror whose name was whispered in fear became the ancestor of scholars whose works would inspire the Renaissance and shape Islamic civilization for generations. But, and here's the key, it was a culture without continuity. Yes, the Timurids advanced art and knowledge, but politically they couldn't hold the empire together. Their territories fractured into competing regions. Central authority dissolved. Local rulers returned. And just like their Mongol predecessors, Timur's heirs learned that fear might win you an empire, but it can't preserve one. The brilliance of Timurid culture lit up the world, but like a fire fed by stolen timber, it burned fast and uneven. No system was in place to preserve it. No stable infrastructure. No succession plan that worked. The cultural legacy endured, but the political structure crumbled. It's a lesson history keeps repeating. Conquest can plant the seeds of greatness, but only stable roots make it grow. Now let's step back and really ask the hard questions. What kind of ruler was Timur, really? Some call him a military genius. Others a tyrant. Some admire his architectural legacy and cultural patronage. Others can't forget the bodies, stacked in towers, buried in mass graves, silenced by swords. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Timur's empire was built almost entirely on coercion. Not consent, not shared vision, not mutual prosperity, but force. At every stage of his rise, violence was not a last resort. It was the strategy. He didn't win loyalty. He imposed obedience. And the price? It was staggering. Entire cities erased. Entire populations displaced. Agricultural systems ruined. Trade networks shattered. And when the blood dried, all that remained was a facade of order held together by fear. This raises a deeper moral question, one that goes beyond Timur. Why do we, so often, romanticize centralized empires? Is it the monuments, the military success, the illusion of control? There's something strangely seductive about the image of a single, powerful ruler bending the world to his will. But if we look closely, that image begins to rot. What we often forget, or ignore, is the cost. The human cost, the economic cost, the generational trauma. And it's not just about Timur. This is a pattern. Time and again in history, centralization through violence gives us short-term glory and long-term decay. It's like building a palace on quicksand. It might dazzle, but it sinks. The memory of Timur today is a mixed bag. Some see him as a symbol of national pride, a builder of cities, a man of vision. Others remember the skull towers and scorched fields. Neither view is wrong, but both are incomplete without context. History doesn't just record what happened, it reflects what we choose to remember, and sometimes, what we choose to forget. So what do we take away from the story of Timur? It's easy to look at his empire as just another chapter in the long, bloody history of conquest, another name in a line of rulers who rose fast, ruled hard, and left behind ruins. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper story, the part that actually matters today. First, look at the fragility of coercive power. Timur had everything: armies, wealth, fear, monuments. But the moment he died, cracks split wide open. Because systems built on force don't last. They look strong, but underneath, hollow. You can't bayonet your way into permanence. You can only delay collapse. Second, there's the resilience of decentralization. Timur's empire fell apart, but the smaller regions, the merchant cities, the cultural enclaves, they survived. Some even thrived once his grip loosened. Why? Because they were rooted in local systems, not imperial commands. They didn't rely on one man. They adapted, collaborated, and endured. And finally, memory. Timur built towers of skulls to make people remember his name. But today, most people don't even know who he was. The monuments may still stand, but the meaning behind them has faded. History chooses what to remember, and sometimes, it forgets on purpose. Maybe that's the lesson. The most dangerous empires aren't just the ones that conquer land. They're the ones that conquer memory, rewriting the past, justifying the present, and leaving future generations unsure of what really happened. If you've enjoyed diving into the complexity behind Timur's rise and fall, be sure to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History for more stories that challenge the textbook versions of the past. And if you want to go deeper into the suppressed and distorted sides of history, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link in the description below. Thanks for watching. And remember, history is never just about the past. It's about the power to shape how we see the world today.